I could go to a poetry reading and really understand it all because I actually know what poems are. I've been going to poetry readings and listening to poetry forever. And especially the young poets there, they're writing pretty much what my MFA students are writing here in Spanish. And so I had that. But it is true that I will wander somewhat erratically through the subjunctive when having a conversation. So I would not hold myself up as someone who's completely learned, but I did. And the great thing, Ordway seemed to be kind of random. I think it was, I credit Senia for recommending that for me, because I was thinking about Argentina, and she said, oh, well, Max, my son, who was 12 at the time, could just go to school in Montevideo. But in some way, it was a crazy choice, because I got off the plane, and I thought it was Polish. You know, it's the zha, 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 zha stuff. It sounds so strange to me then. Now it sounds normal to me, so that when Marcelo doesn't say kaije, it sounds weird to me. But it was an odd choice because it meant I learned an odd kind of Spanish, but Uruguayans, they just say, like, why are you here? Like, why Uruguay? They have no defensiveness about it. No one said to me in my grand project to get all possible Uruguayan literature, poetry translated into English, in which I'm making great strides. They don't say that I'm colonially exploiting them. They sort of feel like they're a little glass box, and they would like to get out. And so it turned out in that way to be a good place to go. But anyway, I just wackily plunged myself into it. I recommend it as a midlife crisis. But I really, for example, would be hard. I mean, I couldn't write an academic paper in Spanish without someone going over it for me, and that's a level beyond which I can really function.
I have a question about the choices that you make as a translator, and oftentimes there are various things that one has to weigh simultaneously. How the word sounds, what it means, the rhythm. And in particular, I'm interested in this tension between domestication of a text and then the foreignness of it too. Like, to what degree do we leave something that sounds foreign to us because it reveals a different modality of thought versus if we domesticate it, then it sounds natural, it sounds like the poet is speaking in English. And I think, I mean, I don't know, it's oftentimes difficult to decide because you want it to sound natural, you don't want it to sound awkward.
I think it's a constant question, and I think I tend to make it for a poet. So with Circe, the things I look back there and I would question myself sometimes you keep the grammatical structure of the Spanish and you don't change it into English. Her poetry seems to me to need to slow down, so I don't use a lot of contractions, even though that's more formal in English. But there are other poets that it's a harder decision, so you have to sort of pick each one. Like, there are even just literal choices, like one of the young poets that I was translating for the Emerging Poetry Anthology writes all these poems about truco, which is this Uruguayan card game. And so it's like a giant metaphor in Uruguay for everything. And yet it is so complicated, and the rules are so complicated, you actually literally sit there and say, for the kind of anthology this is, which is an anthology of 23 young poets, I think I'd be better to use poker than have a footnote that's this long explaining what singing the flowers means when you play a hand in truco, which is also a metaphor for dying. So, it's like that is a choice. In English, you always have the choice about whether to go with the Latinate word, which seems more formal, or to go all, Anglo-Saxon and get gritty. And sometimes one poet seems more one way. Again, Augustine Lucas, who is, again, the young poet with the the two things that Uruguay produces in superabundance are world-class football players, and yay, Celeste, and poets. And Augustine Lucas might be the only one who's both. He's a professional football player and a published poet. And his stuff really craves Anglo-Saxon words because he just really writes about drugs and the street. And other people, it doesn't really seem to treat that way. So I try to get a voice, but I do think you're always making these tentative choices that really, 10 years from now, you look back and you'll say,
yeah,
I don't know.
I think part of what you're saying, too, is that sort of each poet that you translate, you need a different poetics of translation.
Right.
Because if you came to translation and you had your theory already and you said, okay, I'm going to, make this text sound strange to an English reader so they know it's a translation. It doesn't work with, for example, Circe Maia's poems because they're conversational. she has sort of an intimate voice. It wouldn't match with her poetic style.
Right, and there are people who are much more radical translators. I was just at the American Translators Association. I did a panel on Uruguayan and Argentinian women poets, and one of the translators there, Jen Hoffer, is much more experimental translator than I am, amazing translator. She does one of my young Uruguayan poets I adore, Virginia Lucas, and Virginia is pretty experimental, and the way that Jen deals with it is that she puts long translator riffs inside the poems that make it into a double poem, really, to me. It's not really, and Virginia loves that project, so it's more of a collaboration, but that is beyond a footnote. I mean, I think probably half of the words on the page are Jen's and not Virginia's. That would be something that honestly wouldn't have occurred to me. And like, well, you were looking at some of the translations for the Idea Villarino that I'm doing, and she has this complicated theory about stresses that I'm not sure work in English. So I'm, busy poring over those. None of these poets use rhyme. One of the poets that's in my anthology of emerging poets, I had someone else translate, does sonnets, and I said, well, you have to try these for me, or I don't know if I'm going to use them. And he managed to translate them into good sonnets in English, but that's a constant problem with Spanish-English translation, whether to stay with rhyme. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Cecilia, and I was thinking about where to place Circe Maia within a larger Latin American poetic tradition or within the Uruguayan tradition. I was noting several things that I noticed, I guess, about her writing. I was thinking there's that, you said the clarity of language, it seems like relatively simple description, relatively restrained emotionally, but there's like that preference for human work and the kind of embodied experience. There was a slight aversion to adjectives, it felt like.
Yes, she doesn't like to use adjectives. Yeah.
And there was really no surrealism.
No, there's a strong strain. There is surrealism in Uruguay. I mean, they like to claim Isidore Ducasse, the Comte de l'Autrement, because he really lived all of his life in Uruguay before he went back to France, published his book, and died. And there are surrealist poets in Uruguay. Marose de Giorgio is one that's gotten translated a lot recently. He's wonderful. But there is, both in prose, in someone like Onetti, and in someone like, and a lot of the poets, almost a deliberate flatness in Uruguayan poetry. They are sort of the
anti-affect?
Anti-affect. The people in Brazil wear bright colors. The people in Uruguay wear dark. They're kind of melancholy, and they don't use a lot of adjectives. I mean, that's a real exaggeration, but that's a real strong trend. And so this other poet that I'm doing, Idea Villarino, is completely the opposite. I'm translating this book, Poems d'Amore, which is her big famous poems of obsessional love poems for Juan Carlos Onetti, which are basically not love poems. They're like, you bastard, you're not in my bed, where are you poems? But also very flat language, not a lot of metaphor, nothing as crazy as, for example, she's writing about the same time as Sylvia Plath or Anne Sexton, much flatter. So it's kind of an Uruguayan thing.
So, and I was also noting there's a frequent use of these rhetorical questions.
Right.
I don't know, are these characteristics it's somehow unique to Maia's style?
I think they're unique to Maia's style. I would say Maia wouldn't list very many Uruguayan poets as her inspiration. I think she reads she reads both ancient and modern Greek. She reads Latin. She reads the classics. And having been apart from the poetry scene, it's not that people don't know who she is and she doesn't know them. Another very famous elderly living Uruguayan poet, Washington Benedetti, is from Tacuarembó, although he lives in Montevideo. Mario Benedetti is from Paso de los Toros, which is just about half an hour away. So she knows that, but I don't think she would say her influences are that. I think she has sat by herself all those years in Tacuarembó and come up with her own poetics. So I would say she stands apart. And right now in Uruguayan poetry, people love, the young poets, they love Circe. They go to see Circe, and they all hate Mario Benedetti. It's because he's the popular poet, he's the grandfather, he's the one who's held up to them as the the left-wing thing they should be writing. And I have one of the poems in this anthology of emerging poets is called Benedetti is a Bad Grandpa, and that's pretty much their attitude towards it. But that's this moment of killing the father, literally speaking.
Yeah.
But and Mario Benedetti is even flatter, even prosier. I mean, I think his stuff isn't very tight at all. So that would be a kind of, maybe you could say, make a good case for it being a weakness in Uruguayan poetry, but it's certainly a thing.
Yeah, I mean, the initial reaction to what I heard is just exquisite, both in the original and in the translation, something like that. And when you talk with her, did she talk about the dictatorship time? Or, I mean,
Yes.
How did she came out of that, and also another question. I wonder if she uses her poetry in teaching philosophy.
I don't think she used her poetry in teaching philosophy. As a matter of fact, I think most of her philosophy teachers all those years probably didn't even know she was a poet. It's kind of she has a hidden life. It's not that she's not known as a poet. Again, I don't want to say that she's someone who's published 13 books, but she has raised 6 children, 5 daughters and a son, and lived this life as a teacher, and is pretty well known in Uruguay for in Tacuarembó for putting on children's theater. And so the poetry is like inside. It's like this quiet space inside. I also think I read some of the warmer poems, but some of her poetry is really quite cold. That poem Treason would be, she's cast a cold eye. She doesn't believe in the afterlife or epiphany, and so on outside she's very, very warm, and inside there's this sort of cold or cool eye, a philosophical center to things. Yeah. So
The dictatorship.
the dictatorship. So she'll talk about that. For example, she stopped writing after a while during the dictatorship. She certainly stopped publishing. And at the same time, too, right after her husband got out of prison, her son was killed in a car accident. So there's a book of poems that I actually didn't include in this collection that I'd like to translate separately called Distracciones, which is sort of experimental prose poems. And that was her sort of return to poetry. And for a person who's 83, she's published the majority of her books after the dictatorship went out in 83. But she herself, for example, lost her teaching position. So all of them, everybody was thrown out of work. And as was Washington Benedetti, who was also a teacher in Tacuarembó, and he left. And she didn't go into exile, and she wasn't in the end in prison, and Ariel was indeed released. But it has a strong effect. For example, to this day, her husband, Ariel, who's a retired doctor, he won't sleep away from his house. So they have this lovely cottage that's about, I don't know, not even a mile out of town on this lake. And she goes out, and Circe loves to swim, she goes out and swims laps. And they'll go out and have, the 2 big things on the weekend for Uruguayan families are asado on Saturdays or raviolis on Sundays. So they'll go out and eat at the cottage for a meal, but Ariel won't spend the night. And I think that's from being in prison. So it has a constant effect. But I would say she is not continued to be profoundly political. I mean, she's certainly left-wing, but then every poet in Uruguay is, as far as I can tell. But she wasn't in exile. Some poets, Ida Vitali and Guadamelano, went out and never came back. And Maria Benedetti was in exile, came back. She came the closest of any poet I know to actually being in prison. I mean, I think that was amazing that they didn't arrest her. And Uruguay had a larger percentage of their population in prison under the dictatorship than any other country. Fewer people killed in the end, but more people in prison.
Does she write about football, Jessica?
No, she doesn't. I haven't actually had a football conversation with her, but I have to say pretty much everyone in Uruguay is big on the national team. But the big division in Uruguay, even some places like Tacuarembó, which has its own, I don't think it's first division now, team, is there are 2 big teams, Peñarol and Nacional, and there are 3 political parties now. There's Frente Amplio, which is the broad left-wing coalition, and the 2 traditional parties, the Nacional, the Blancos, the Colorados. So it used to be you say that everyone was born, Blanco or Colorado, but it's true that everyone's born Peñarol or Nacional. So I haven't asked her that. That may be a tough question. You can always talk football. Football and politics with any Uruguayan, forever.
So Benedetti invented this word incilio instead of exilio.
Incilio, yeah, domestic exile.
So she probably lived the incilio instead of the exilio.
For example, her novel that I was talking about, The Trip to Salta and Viaje a Salta, was published anonymously during the dictatorship and only republished under her name afterwards. So. But it's not a time that has gone away in Uruguay. They have not had a reconciliation. They have an amnesty law. They've passed twice, and so there have not been trials. And they're still finding. There was this awful thing recently where they had taken bodies of people who were killed by the dictatorship and reburied them and planted trees on top of them, so it'd be hard to find their bodies. And it's called Proyecto Zanahoria. Operation Carrot. So they're busy digging up people with their hands behind their backs under trees. And this is after, we're in the 13th year of a left-wing government. So it's mostly not happening as far as that, as far as reconciliation or as far as trials. Everyone's just dying. And Uruguay is such a small country. You always, when the last president, Jose Mujica, just went out of office, because you'd only be in for 6 years. When he ran for office, he ran against Pedro Bordaberry, who is a fellow senator and the son of the dictator who put him in prison. Because, Jose Mujica's the head of the Tupamaros. He spent 13 years in prison, most of it at the bottom of a well. So doesn't go away so easily. But the young poets, for example, sometimes they write about the dictatorship. A lot of them have gone back to writing about the sadness of the early historical period. For example, Uruguay has the distinction of having killed every last one of their indígenas. They sent the last ones to a World's Fair in France and didn't get them back. And now they're kind of sorry about that. So the younger poets write about that more than, I'd say, the dictatorship. And the great trauma for the younger poets was the crash in 2001, like in Argentina, where suddenly they said that a third of the apartments in Montevideo were empty. So a lot of the sort of second exile and economic exile, where people go abroad to work, and a lot of those don't come back. So there's a scattering of young poets who are in Norway and Toronto and Mexico because they went out to work or to get degrees and never came back. So it's a kind of more traumatic for them than the dictatorship, probably.
Cecilia, has there been an opening of the state police archives following the dictator's fall? I know that, for example, when Nastasia's police archives were opened,
in theory,
all of these people found other neighbors, and I would think about a small country, imagining the effect of
not really. It's a very Uruguayan thing, I have to say. When I first was there, I just didn't really even believe it, but you have to be there for a while and it makes sort of sense. But when they voted Jose Mujica in, so they voted in the second Frente Amplio government. They had one for 6 years, left-wing government. They voted the second left-wing president in. They also voted to voted for the second time for amnesty for everybody. So the first time they did it, they said, it's because if we don't vote for amnesty, the military won't leave. But they just did it again. And so there is a general feeling among people who are, just go out into the countryside, talk to someone. Not the people I know. The poets, the intellectuals, they're all fierce about this. There's a giant silent march every year for the people who are disappeared. But the average people, they just don't want to talk about it. They don't want to know. They don't think it's a good idea. They have no intention of going back into it. And so I think if they held an election about whether there should be amnesty every day for the next 20 years, it would always pass. And it's just, but it's the opposite of what's been happening in Argentina. It's not. Uruguayans it's a smaller country and they're more conservative, and I don't mean that necessarily in a religious sense. They're just loath to make a noise about things, I think is the way to do it. And the other thing that's different in Uruguay is a very not religious country. Like, this was a surprise to me after being in Mexico. It's hard to find a church. They're all, in theory, Catholic, or 80% of them are. It's a pretty good-sized Jewish community. But no one goes to church, and really, you really have a hard time finding women. And due to the separation of church and state from the 1900s on, people actually do refer to holidays by their official names. Like, no one says Semana Santa, everybody says the Semana de Turismo, which is its official name, Spring Break Week. And sometimes people even say, for Navidad, they'll say Dia de la Familia, which is what it's called. So that's also odd for South America. And again, the reason why they all have high school philosophy classes. That's their moral compass. And they also have in high school, everyone studies Shakespeare and Walt Whitman. It's a set curriculum. So that's odd too. And every single Uruguayan has read Leaves of Grass to some extent or another.
And their poets reject it by writing flat, adjective-free language.
It's not an amazing translation, actually, but they read it.
So Jesse, this is maybe what, a sixth of her?
Less. Her collected work is 400 pages, and this is, since it's 150 pages, so that's half that is in Spanish. And then since she published, since I was working on this project, much to my surprise, I kept asking her if she had any new poems, because I thought we'd do a new and selected, but she kept saying she didn't, and then she published another book. She has a brand new book as of last year, Dualidades, and she just won this big prize in Uruguay, which is such an Uruguayo prize. She won the Grand National Intellectual Prize the Grand National Prize for Intellectual Labor. And never in America would there ever be a prize for intellectual labor. It's given every 3 years, and it can be given, like for mathematics or something. But she got it, the Grand Prize for Intellectual Labor.
So do you have future plans for publishing more Maia's translations?
I would like to do another, you can't immediately do unless of course this one, she wins the Nobel Prize. You can't immediately do a collected because, as they say in the trade, that kills this book. Nobody buys a selected if there's a collected. So I would like to translate her most recent book, Dualidades, which has a lot of poems about art, something she's always written about. And I would also like to translate that collection of experimental prose poems, the Dislecciones. But the next thing is when I go back down in March, we'll probably have a book presentation in Uruguay. If you're an author, I put this forward as an American model, Uruguayan model, we should transfer it to here. When you have a book presentation, when you publish a book, it's like having a wedding reception. So you have food and wine, and people are invited, and it's very formal. Usually critics talk about the book, and maybe the author just talks a little. But the main thing, every single person who comes has to buy the book. They wouldn't accept the invitation if they weren't going to buy the book. So a book presentation in Uruguay is the main way one sells a book. But the music and the wine, that's very nice. One last question? I think we're out of time. Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about your process of translation.
Mm-hmm.
You said at the beginning, and of course, having read some of your work, I know this as well, that you have a kind of a bilingual, one might even say bicultural past between English and French.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm bilingual too, Spanish and English, and one of the things that I've come to understand is how it is that having a bilingual sensibility sometimes can change the way you see both languages.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, since obviously Spanish isn't your second language, but here you are, and you are translating from Spanish into English, do you think that your bilingualism in any way had an effect on your process of translation?
Yes, I think it is. Certainly, having known French made it easier to learn Spanish. I will say that when I hold this out is that you can learn a language quickly. But the first thing I didn't mention when I was saying that probably the craziest thing I did beyond translating is I actually have a book of poems I wrote in Spanish that was published in Uruguay. When I was down there, what I do is I write all the time, and I was trying to think all the time in Spanish, so I started writing poems in Spanish. And eventually, when you go to these readings, usually reading in Uruguay is 5 people in a bar, so it's everybody gets up and reads a little, and I would read the poems, and eventually one of the editors there asked me to publish the book, and I actually did it bilingually. I translated my Spanish poems into English, and that was hard. I actually found translating my own poems harder than translating Circe Maia's. My first tries, they sent sort of Google translated to me, but I don't know. This won't answer your question at all, but my metaphor for translating is it's like watch repair. You just sit there for hours with your little loop on and look at things and look at things and look at things, and then you go to the shower and you take a shower and you go, oh! Or you wake up in the middle of the night and you go, oh! That's how I would do it. I have to say, it is easier to pick out the poems that I thought translated well than to do all 400 pages. There are poems of hers that are difficult to translate because they're so simple. She loves to close a poem that's on the slight difference of meaning between the noun version of something in Spanish and the verb, or vice versa. And that does not always exist in English.
Right.
I mean, you could translate the meaning of it, that it wouldn't seem so clever and jewel box-like.
Yeah.
But like this other poet that I'll do does, Tatiana Oroño, makes up words. And so, like one of her poems, it's called Madror. And so I thought about that a long time. You can ask Tatiana questions, she will answer you, but she's really quite flaky, and so sometimes the answer isn't helpful. So I thought about it, asked all these other people what it was. It's a combination of the word madre and dolor. But I couldn't get a single Uruguayan to recognize that. They said, I don't know, maybe it's someone's name, maybe it's a novel, maybe did you Google it? And so I haven't translated that poem into English. I just looked at that and thought, Mother pain? I don't know. Thank you.
All right. You're very welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
make this text sound strange to an English reader so they know it's a translation. It doesn't work with, for example, Circe Maia's poems because they're conversational. She has sort of an intimate voice. It wouldn't match with her poetic style.
Right, and there are people who are much more radical translators. I was just at the American Translators Association. I did a panel on Uruguayan and Argentinian women poets, and one of the translators there, Jen Hoffer, is much more experimental translator than I am. Amazing translator. She does one of my young Uruguayan poets I adore, Virginia Lucas, and Virginia is pretty experimental. And the way that Jen deals with it is that she puts long translator riffs inside the poems that make it into a double poem, really, to me. It's not really, and Virginia loves that project, so it's more of a collaboration. But that is beyond a footnote. I mean, I think probably half of the words on the page are Jen's and not Virginia's. That would be something that honestly wouldn't have occurred to me. And like, well, you were looking at some of the translations for the Idea Villarino that I'm doing, and she has this complicated theory about stresses that I'm not sure work in English. So I'm, making great strides. They don't say that I'm colonially exploiting them. They sort of feel like they're a little glass box, and they would like to get out. And so it turned out in that way to be a good place to go. But anyway, I just wackily plunged myself into it. I recommend it as a midlife crisis. But I really, for example, would be hard. I mean, I couldn't write an academic paper in Spanish without someone going over it for me, and that's a level beyond which I can really function.
I have a question about the choices that you make as a translator, and oftentimes there are various things that one has to weigh simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
How the word sounds, what it means, the rhythm, and in particular I'm interested in this tension between domestication of a text and then the foreignness of it too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to what degree do we leave something that sounds foreign to us because it reveals a different modality of thought versus if we domesticate it, then it sounds.
What singing the flowers means when you play a hand in truco, which is also a metaphor for dying. So, it's like that is a choice. In English, you always have the choice about whether to go with the Latinate word, which seems more formal, or to go all, Anglo-Saxon and get gritty. And sometimes one poet seems more one way. Again, Augustin Lucas, who is, again, the young poet with the two things that Uruguay produces in superabundance are world-class football players, and yay, Celeste, and poets. And Augustin Lucas might be the only one who's both. He's a professional football player and a published poet. And his stuff really craves Anglo-Saxon words because he just really writes about drugs and the street. And other people, it doesn't really seem to treat that way. So I try to get a voice, but I do think you're always making these tentative choices that really, 10 years from now, you look back and you'll say,
yeah,
I don't know.
I think part of what you're saying too is that sort of each poet that you translate, you need a different poetics of translation.
Right.
Because if you came to translation and you had your theory already and you said, okay, I'm going to natural, it sounds like the poet is speaking in English. And I don't know, it's oftentimes difficult to decide because you want it to sound natural, you don't want it to sound awkward.
I think it's a constant question, and I think I tend to make it for a poet. So with Circe, the things I look back there and I would question myself sometimes you keep the grammatical structure of the Spanish and you don't change it into English. Her poetry seems to me to need to slow down, so I don't use a lot of contractions, even though that's more formal in English. But there are other poets that it's a harder decision, so you have to sort of pick each one. Like, there are even just literal choices, like one of the young poets that I was translating for the Emerging Poetry Anthology writes all these poems about truco, which is this Uruguayan card game. And so it's like a giant metaphor in Uruguay for everything. And yet it is so complicated, and the rules are so complicated, you actually literally sit there and say, for the kind of anthology this is, which is an anthology of 23 young poets, I think I'd be better to use poker than have a footnote that's this long explaining. I could go to a poetry reading and really understand it all because I actually know what poems are. I've been going to poetry readings and listening to poetry forever. And especially the young poets there, they're writing pretty much what my MFA students are writing here in Spanish. And so I had that. But it is true that I will wander somewhat erratically through the subjunctive when having a conversation. So I would not hold myself up as someone who's completely learned, but I did. And the great thing, orderway seemed to be kind of random. I think it was, I credit Senya for recommending that for me, because I was thinking about Argentina, and she said, oh, well, Max, my son, who was 12 at the time, could just go to school in Montevideo. But in some way, it was a crazy choice, because I got off the plane, and I thought it was Polish. You know, it's the zha, 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 zha stuff. It sounds so strange to me then. Now it sounds normal to me, so that when Marcelo doesn't say kaije, it sounds weird to me. But it was an odd choice because it meant I learned an odd kind of Spanish, but Uruguayans, they just say, like, why are you here? Like, why Uruguay? They have no defensiveness about it. No one said to me in my grand project to get all possible Uruguayan literature, poetry translated into English, in which I'm making